Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are digging into a really urgent analysis from Professor Jeffrey Sachs about the escalating crisis between the United States and Iran. He's warning that we are on the absolute brink of a major conflict, and we're going to walk through his entire argument step by step.
So this is what really kicks things off. For Jeffrey Sachs, this isn't just some casual political talk. He sees it as a crystal clear signal of intent, especially when you pair it with the huge military buildup that was happening in the region. The language is blunt, and the threat, Sachs argues, is very, very real.
And that brings us to the core question we're tackling. We're going to unpack Jeffrey Sachs' perspective piece by piece to really understand why he looks at the current situation and sees an almost unavoidable slide into war, not just another tense diplomatic standoff.
Okay, let's dive right into his first point. See, for Sachs, when you put those two things together, the massive military buildup and these kinds of fiery public statements, it all points to only one conclusion: an attack is coming. He argues this isn't a bluff. It's the final stage of an operation that's been in the works for a long time. And this is where Sachs zooms out a bit and gives us some really critical context. In his view, this crisis didn't just pop up out of nowhere. No, he sees it as the result of a decades-long push from Israel, all aimed at convincing the United States to go after the ultimate goal, removing the government in Iran. And that idea, that this has been a long time coming, that leads us directly into the heart of his argument. He basically contends that every single action, every sanction, every threat has all been for one main objective: not to negotiate some kind of deal, but to achieve regime change. Now, this timeline is absolutely crucial for understanding Sachs's thinking. So first, you have this landmark nuclear deal, right? It's reached, it's ratified internationally. Then, boom, the U.S. just unilaterally pulls out. And then, and this is the part Sachs sees as the most damning, a bombing happens just 48 hours before new talks were supposed to start. He points to this pattern as clear evidence that any path to diplomacy has been systematically blown up. So when you look at that timeline, for Sachs, that whole idea of making a deal just becomes a complete smokescreen. He argues that if negotiation was ever the real goal, you wouldn't keep dismantling these diplomatic milestones. So, he concludes, the real objective has always been the overthrow of the Iranian government. So, okay, if the goal is regime change, what's the method? How are they supposedly doing it? Well, Sachs uses a very specific term to describe the strategy he believes is being used against Iran: hybrid warfare. Let's break down what that actually means, because it's a key concept. Hybrid warfare isn't your traditional invasion with tanks rolling across the border. It's a more subtle, multi-front attack that's designed to destabilize a country from the inside out, using pretty much every tool you have, except for an all-out war.
And here's what that looks like in practice, according to Sachs. It's a coordinated effort, right? You use economic sanctions to absolutely cripple the country's finances. You launch cyber attacks. You allegedly use agents to stir up protests and unrest. And you carry out targeted assassinations and bombings. The whole point is to create chaos and weaken the government from every possible angle at once.
But out of all these tactics, there's one that Sachs really zooms in on, and that's the economic front. He points to a term the U.S. Treasury itself has used: economic statecraft, and he highlights one key piece of evidence he believes proves what it's really all about. And this quote is what Sachs presents as a key piece of evidence. It's from Scott Bessant, a prominent hedge fund manager and political donor. Sachs sees this as a surprisingly honest admission from a powerful figure, explicitly connecting U.S. economic pressure to bank failures, dollar shortages, and, well, ultimately, to people taking to the streets.
Yeah, for Sachs, there's just no room for interpretation here. He sees this statement as the smoking gun, a clear admission from someone in the know that the whole point of this financial pressure is to cause economic collapse and social unrest inside Iran, all while framing it as things moving in a positive way. So that brings us to how this whole hybrid warfare strategy is packaged for the public. Sachs argues that the official story we often hear is really designed to hide the reality of what's actually happening on the ground. And you can see the two conflicting stories laid out right here. The public narrative is that Iran's economy is falling apart because of its own internal corruption. But according to Sachs, the collapse is a direct result of that deliberate economic statecraft. We hear that the street protests are organic, a genuine popular uprising. He points to claims that foreign agents are actually fueling the unrest. And finally, the stated goal is always about forcing Iran into a new deal. But Sachs insists the real endgame is, and always has been, regime change.
So what happens if this all escalates into a full-blown war? This is where Sachs really gets into the stakes. He warns that a conflict with Iran would be totally unlike any other recent war in the region, with potentially catastrophic consequences for the entire world.
Sachs doesn't just give a vague warning. He outlines what he sees as Iran's very credible options for hitting back. He points to their ability to get through sophisticated air defenses with hypersonic missiles, which could be aimed at incredibly sensitive targets. And here's the most alarming part. If the conflict turns into a fight for survival for the nation, he believes Iran could make a desperate dash for nuclear weapons.
He does not mince words here. Sachs's assessment of what could happen is just stark and absolute. He believes this isn't just a regional problem. This is a conflict that could be globally ruinous, something that could destabilize the most explosive region on Earth and pull in other major world powers.
And so that leaves us with this final, really heavy question. Sachs suggests that maybe the only thing that could stop this is a strong, unified wall of opposition from the rest of the world, especially from Europe and other countries in the region. But with all the pieces moving into place and the rhetoric getting hotter, his analysis really forces us to ask, is it already too late?